In this video, I'm going to take you from the collage table to the paint table, where I'll show you how I work on these small wooden panels over the course of a few days. And this is a great method if you don't have a lot of time to work. So because I'm using gloss medium, I find it really sticks to the skin, so that's why I'm wearing gloves. So what I want to show is just how I build up these small wooden panels with paint. And these are abstract compositions inspired by my collages. I like the look of a built-up surface with different opacities of paint and different types of edges. I find that the marks made by collaging with paint to be really interesting, and when you use parchment paper to apply paint to a surface, you can actually get some really interesting clean edges to your shapes. This reminds me a lot of collage, which is how I started working this way. So I'm using birch plywood panels that are 1/4 of an inch thick, and I bought a big sheet at the hardware store and I just cut it down to size. So after I cut the panels down, I'll sand it and then apply 3 coats of gesso to either one or both sides of the board. And sometimes I'll start just by making marks either with paint or some other material like acrylic marker or crayon. And here I'm just showing the difference in the paint applied to the parchment paper. Sometimes the paint will go on really smooth with not a lot of brush strokes. It really all depends on the consistency of the paint. So I'm using gloss medium here to adhere the painted parchment paper to the surface of the panel. When you apply the gloss medium, you want to be really generous with the amount because you want to make sure that the surface of the painted parchment paper is completely stuck to the painting. I'll show a little later on the method of painting onto the parchment paper. It's really easy. To adhere the painted parchment paper to the surface of the panel, I'll just use another layer of parchment paper over top and then fix it down with this tool, which is a paintbrush with a kind of rubber squeegee instead of bristles. Once the piece of parchment paper is adhered to the surface, I'll just go over it again with my fingers just to make sure that it's lying really flat. Sometimes it can get buckled, but you can easily just use your fingers to flatten it out. And I'll also use the paintbrush just to clean up the globs of gloss medium on the edges, and it's totally okay if some gets onto the back of the painted parchment paper. What you're looking for is a really good seal between the parchment paper and the painted surface, because all these layers of paint, the surface of the panel tends to get really uneven, and you can probably see that when I move the panel around in the light. It can just get very bumpy and textured, and this is just because of all the layers of paint. So mostly I don't mind this, but if it gets too bumpy, then I'll just sand it down with a palm sander, or I'll just use a couple of coats of self-leveling gel, which I'll demonstrate at the end. Once the gloss medium is dry, I usually leave it overnight, and then you can peel off the parchment paper and the paint remains stuck to the panel. So here's an example of a panel that was getting too textured. I've already sanded it down, and now I'm applying a coat of the gloss medium before I add any more painted layers. I usually work on several panels at once. I try not to get into the trap of overthinking what the next move will be. I just try to work steadily and not take long pauses that will kill the momentum. So while those are drying, I can take some time to make some of this painted parchment paper. I have a various assortment of bottles and jars that I reuse with acrylic paint. Some are tube colors and others are just colors I've mixed up. And here I'm adding a little yellow ochre to this green, and I'm just using a paper plate as a palette, and I'm giving the paint a really good mix. So now I'm just tearing off a strip of parchment paper right from the roll, and then you just take your paint and apply it directly to the parchment paper. It is really that simple, and depending on the paint, you might get some brush strokes or lacing, but just make sure you apply a generous amount of paint and it shouldn't be too much of a problem. So that's one sheet done that I'll put on the floor to dry. Sometimes the parchment paper will tend to curl up at the edges, but you just have to uncurl it and it should usually stay pretty flat. This is also a great way to use leftover paint on your palette instead of just throwing it away. So now I'm going to mix up another color. I'll just take the same plate, add some more of the green, and this time I'll mix it with this blue. So sometimes I'll just play around with a different range of the color. It's a great way to play with color mixing and experiment with paint. Sometimes the best way to learn is just by playing, and I really think there is no such thing as an ugly color. You just have to find the right color combination. You can also layer different marks and paint colors onto the same piece of parchment paper. You just have to remember what paint goes down first and what is visible on the panel. It's the same idea as printmaking, where the image will be revealed from the bottom up. So this is a really good way too to use up old paint that you might have lying around. Leftover paint will tend to get worse in quality, so it's not a good idea just to stockpile your paint because it will dry out, or sometimes it separates, and it can also get moldy. So I know that it's a temptation to be very precious with your materials, but I always have to remind myself to use up what I have because it's not going to get any better over time. Remember, the only wasted material is the material that you're not using. So this is the last piece of parchment paper, and to wrap this up in the studio, I just usually keep some paper nearby to wipe my brush on. And these are just quick marks just to clean my brush off, and then later on, if it looks interesting, I'll just use it as collage paper. So here's the studio wall where you can see some of the painted panels that I'm working on just sitting on the shelf to dry. And there on the floor is the painted parchment paper that's drying. And apologies for the complete messiness of the studio. I am trying to clean it up and get more organized. Okay, so this is the next day and the gloss medium is dry and I'm gonna peel the paper off the panels that I worked on from the day before. You can see that the parchment paper peels off very easily, and some of these parchment pieces can be reused up to a certain point. This technique is really fun because you don't ever really know what it's going to look like because you're always working in reverse, very similar to printmaking like I mentioned. And here on this piece you can see there's some paint hanging over the side, but all you need to do is fold it over and it will actually stick to the paint underneath. So working this way is always like a mini reveal every time you peel off the parchment paper. And to some this may seem like a slow approach, but I like slowing down, and I find that when you're working abstractly, things can be very quick. And I find that this way of working just allows me to take a look at everything before I decide what the next move is going to be. And sometimes when I'm looking back at these videos, I wish I could have stopped at that certain point because it was looking good. But I know that this is just the process of working, and you can always get back to that point again in some way. So you can see here that you can work with more than one cut piece of parchment paper. Just as long as the shapes aren't overlapping, you can stick as many painted parchment pieces to the surface of the panel as you want. So the advantage of working this way is just that you can get really interesting edges and shapes and layers of paint, which is very different than a brush. And I do also use a brush, which you'll see later on in the video, but this is just another method of applying paint that is different and can be very interesting. So here I'm just sorting through my parchment paper scraps. Some of these scraps are too old and I'm just gonna throw them away, but these little ones I can use again. This technique also works for image transfers, which I'll show later on in this video. And I just want to say that I'm using gloss medium here because it dries clear. And you can also use matte medium, but I find that it just dulls the colors a little bit. So this is still the same day, but now I'm back at the paint table to add some more layers of paint to the two panels on the right. And then the ones on the left, I'm going to do an image transfer. The image transfer technique is one that I figured out from YouTube, and it's just a way of transferring the laser toner from a laser print or a photocopy onto the surface of a painting in a way that's actually very similar to this painted parchment paper technique. And it's important that the image you want to transfer is a laser toner image. Inkjet printers will not work with this method. And you can see that I'm making the image transfer onto a white area of the panel. So the black toner will have the most contrast and be really visible. You need to consider the tone value of the area that you're applying the image transfer to. An image transfer to a darker area will be very subtle. So you just use gloss medium to adhere that toner layer face down to the panel exactly like you would with the painted parchment paper. You let it dry, and then once it's dry, you wet the paper and then just rub it off and you're left with the reverse image on the panel. The only caveat here is that with image transfers, you want to make sure that you're using a copyright-free reference, or you can photocopy your own artwork and drawings and you can just use that. And this method for me is just another way to make different marks on the surface and to take the control out of my hand for a little bit. It just gives me something different to react against for the next painting session. Okay, so here is another panel in progress. You can see that black shape. I've used pinking shears along one edge. And pinking shears are sewing scissors that you use to cut fabric so that it will resist fraying. And it will give you this zigzag edge. And I really like that zigzag line. I think it makes for a really interesting shape. Okay, so this panel will be one that I'm going to paint. I collect all these little jars and plastic bottles, and now I'm using some black paint that I've stored in this little jar. And I like my paint to be a bit on the more fluid side, so I'll often add some water to make it less heavy. And I'm also using a paint edger, and you can find these in hardware stores. House painters use them to make a cleaner line of paint and to protect the trim. I'm using it here just to make a sharp line, a cleaner edge with my brush. And I like to use black in these small abstract panels just to give me a wider value range. And I use these little cards that I've painted with black on one side just to show me what areas could use a lighter or darker color. So you might be able to see that I have a small stack of paintings that I'm working through there on the right. I'll take all the paintings that are dry from the day before and I'll go through the ones that need more work. On this next panel, you can see that area with the red grid pattern. That is a tissue paper print that I made, and I just stuck it directly onto the panel with gloss medium. And in fact, you don't ever really need to use glue. Gloss medium is just a great all-purpose medium to use for anything you want to stick to your panel. So I'm just going through the stack of panels and adding a mark to each one. Sometimes I'll do this assembly style of paintings when I'm just still figuring out the panels and I just want to get them going. The trick is not to think too hard or to deliberate at this stage because you could really almost go anywhere. You just want to keep going and make a move to see where it takes you. It's a process of addition and subtraction. It's really like solving a puzzle. And slowly, each of these little paintings will start to resolve, and you'll be left wondering how these layers all came together. One of my favorite things about painting abstractly like this is just the real mystery of how these compositions are built up. So this is the next day, and I'm demonstrating how to take off the paper for the image transfer. I've just sprayed the paper that is adhered to the panel with water, and I have a damp rag sitting on top. So the idea is that the paper gets saturated with the water, and it will eventually just rub off, leaving the toner layer stuck to the gloss medium. It's a bit of a longer process than easily peeling back the parchment paper, but the effect is really interesting, which you'll see in a bit. It does take some time and some water and some patience, but eventually all the paper will get removed. You can start off a bit more aggressively, but you have to be more gentle as the image starts to become visible. The toner layer can be very delicate, and if you're too rough, then you can actually rub away that toner if you're not being too careful. And it's best to do this process without gloves on because you really need to feel for the paper with your fingers. It's a really very tactile process, and you can actually feel for where the paper is stuck to the surface and where you need to add more water and just to rub away that paper pulp. Because this technique involves really wetting the surface of the painting, you want to make sure that all your paint is dry and that all of your materials are not water soluble, because otherwise you can make a really big mess. And this is one advantage to working in acrylics. It is really durable and waterproof when it's fully dry. You can see that I'm using some of the green parchment paper that I just made the day before, along with some other colors. I like to have a whole range of colors on hand because you never know what will inspire you on a given day. And I find that these gut feelings and intuitions are really important when you're working abstractly. You really need to go with what you're feeling, and it's a great way to exercise that sensory muscle. It's weird, but it's not anything you can describe with words. It's just a feeling that is pointing to a certain direction that you just need to follow and see where it leads. It's more of a poetic way of working, and it actually really makes the time fly by. And similar to collage, you'll often have these little pieces of off-cut parchment paper that you can use on other panels. These little shapes don't need to be wasted. They can always be used as little interesting moments on other panels. So if you don't have a lot of time to get all your brushes out and mix up a bunch of paint, then I really recommend this method of working because you're still playing with color and shapes, but you're only actually just using one material, which is gloss medium. And you can work on a number of panels, and afterwards you only have to clean out one brush. So this next day, I'll demonstrate how I use clear leveling gel to finish off a painting. And this can be the last layer over a finished piece, or you can use clear leveling gel just to even out the surface of your panel if you find that it's getting too textured and bumpy. Working on top of the clear leveling gel is actually very interesting because you get these really cool shadow effects from the paint on the top layer of the leveling gel. I have a video where I explain in more detail how I use this clear leveling gel, but the important thing is to apply thin coats of the gel. You don't want the gel to get too thick because it can crack when it's drying and it can be very difficult to fix. I'm using a trowel here to smooth out the gel because these panels are a bit on the large size. For small pieces, I'll use a plastic scraper or even a credit card. You just want to make sure that the gel is covering the complete surface area of the wooden panel. And I'm using a small paint knife to remove the bigger air bubbles that will sometimes appear. You don't have to worry about the surface being perfectly even because this gel will self-level as it's drying. And before I move the pieces to dry inside a cardboard box, I will spray the surface of the gel with some rubbing alcohol just to remove the smaller air bubbles. You just need 1 or 2 squirts of the alcohol, not a lot. And it will take at least 24 hours for the clear leveling gel to dry. The longer you leave it to dry, the better and the harder the surface will be. I know that I'm often inspired by watching other artists' work, and this is just one of the ways that I move from collage to paint in the studio, just to mix up my workflow a little bit. I really try to enter the studio with a feeling of curiosity about what I will discover, and I find that working this way really discourages boredom and endless deliberation. So if you don't have a lot of time to work, then I would really recommend trying this way. Thanks for watching. Bye.